The chord we're going to start with is an E chord, and it's the E form. Now, if you're familiar with the cage system, you know there are 5 block forms based off of the open position chords. So let's just take the typical E chord that you know. You learned it early on. Now, when you play this chord, you know that it's root 3rd and 5th. If you don't, you can look at the diagram that's labeled E, and this voicing would always be from low to high, 1, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1. So in essence, you've got a big E power chord, and you've got that 1 major 3rd occurring on the 3rd string. Practice fingering it with your 2nd, 3rd, and 4th fingers, and even try it with some other fingerings. We're using double stops just for fun. You want to always stretch yourself. But if you encounter this chord, now I'm only going to scratch the surface on scales, but if you encounter this chord, we're going to use a system where we just line the numbers up. If you look at the chord, you analyze it and you say, what are the different numbers that we have in the chord? The chord is 1, 3, and 5. Now we'll be dealing with heptatonic scales, your basic major scale, and all the modes generated from the major scale, and some of the modes generated from the melodic minor, and perhaps one from the harmonic minor. So they are all 7-note scales. So if we have a chord that has 3 components, a root, 3rd, and a 5th, all you got to do is a little subtraction. 7 notes in the scale, 7 possible notes. You have 3 notes in the chord, so 7 minus 3 is 4. So there are 4 variables. Now if you want to get really analytical and go crazy on this, sit down and write down all the possibilities of the remaining 4 tones. We're just going to go very basic here. If you encounter this E chord, there are a few modes that will be very obvious. The first one being an E major scale, or E Ionian. That would simply be, that fits right against the chord. You might say, I don't need to use all those notes. But remember, you want to see the biggest possible scale and then edit down, delete the notes that don't fit stylistically for whatever music you're playing. So if I'm playing over this chord, my first choice would be E Ionian. Of course, I'm taking into consideration that is a static chord. If it's in a context of a progression, you have to analyze. Indeed, this chord could be functioning as something other than a 1 chord. But if we're just doing an analysis here, E Ionian would be a viable scale over this chord. Then you would have the Lydian mode, which changes and puts a sharp 4 instead of a natural 4. And that would be the next scale that you could use. The next scale would be Mixolydian. Now what happens when you go to the Mixolydian, you're putting in a flat 7. The thing is that the chord doesn't really outline or feed that flat 7. So you have to be the judge of how far you want to extend your scale by putting other tones in. E7 would obviously establish E Mixolydian as the only source right there. You wouldn't use Ionian or Lydian because they both have a natural 7. But we'll include Mixolydian. That would be a scale that would fit over this. So now I'm going to play a little jam track where I just strum this E chord against a drum groove on a drum machine. No bass line or anything, because I'm going to be hitting the bass. Remember, we have the bass line as the lowest tone. The root of the chord is the lowest tone on the 6th string. So what I'll do is I'll play for a couple minutes, and don't forget on your player, you can loop the jam section. You can loop any section if you want of this video, and all videos are like that. Then you would also have overtone, which is called Lydian flat 7. That's an alternate name. It's kind of a cross between the Mixolydian and the Lydian. And then you'd also have E Phrygian dominant. These are all diagrammed out. That would give you a Spanish sound, that whole flamenco vibe, even though the chord isn't establishing that as much as if we go and start feeding in some of those important color tones from the scale along with the chord. So let me just continue here. I'll play against this drum machine, and I suggest you try each of these scales over this chord.